Great. Hi, everyone, and welcome to JWI's National Alliance Workshop webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sierra Schnitzer. I am the Senior Director of Survivor Supports and Initiatives at Jewish Women International. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please type out your questions for the presenter in the chat or in the Q&A. There will be time at the end of our presentation for our presenters to answer all questions. We are using automatic closed captioning. To show captions in the bottom of the Zoom window, click the up arrow button next to the closed caption and then click on Show Subtitle. This webinar is being recorded and a recording will be emailed out later this week along with a PDF of the transcripts and any additional resources. If you're interested in receiving a professional development certificate, make sure to fill out the form linked in our follow-up email, which will be sent out in the next few days. So we have a few presenters today. So I'm going to introduce each of them and then turn it over to them. So first we have Christy. She possesses an extensive background in program development, strategic planning, and relationship management with subject matter expertise in homelessness, housing, and vulnerable populations. Her experience is inclusive of work at the local, state, and national levels. Dee Fox has worked with domestic and sexual violence movement for 30 years with a focus on fundraising, organizational development, nonprofit administration, and domestic violence population-specific housing and economic justice programming. Rebecca is a lifelong advocate and for survivors of gender violence. With intersecting issues of oppression, she approaches advocacy through the lenses of trauma, human rights, healing, and liberation. And last but not least, Marlena works in support of gender-based violence, housing, and economic policy engagement by identifying, supporting, and decimating product deliverables. So I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful speakers for today and get excited for our January webinar.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for having us. Like was mentioned earlier, my name is Marlena Moore. I use they, them pronouns. As part of the consortium that we all work with, I am part of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. As you can see from our title slide, we are all from different organizations. We work together to further develop understanding of the intersection of intimate partner violence and housing needs. So given all of that and the request that came through for us to provide this training, we're identifying that we're gonna provide and support understanding the relationship between sexual and domestic violence, homelessness, and the range of housing related needs survivors might have. Explore best practices to inform and promote safe housing options, as well as strengthen housing related advocacy, and then supporting sharing capacity building tools, trainings, and resources available through our website, Safe Housing Partnerships, and then identify potential funding sources for program development. And like was mentioned earlier, we are going to have a Q&A at the end of this presentation. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box or into the chat box, and we will hopefully get to them as much as we can before the end of this webinar. And then in recognition that the Domestic Violence Housing and Technical Assistance Consortium is a collaboration between several federal partners and TA providers, this slide is identifying who is who, and then also being mindful of the fact that since we are also collaborating with the Sexual Violence Housing Consortium as well, this is why Rebecca is also in the space with us from Resource Sharing Project as providing the sexual violence scope sourcing for us. So thank you for being here too. And then we are going to show a video talking about the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, because a good chunk of the work that we do identifies how racial justice is necessary in order to provide supports. And Christy, I'm not sure if that video is actually going to play. I can share my screen and show the video too.
Thank you, Marlena, because right when you started saying that, y'all are seeing this in real time as problem solving. I was like, I don't think I have the link. I don't have it. So do you want me to quit screen sharing so you can share?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Advance computer audio. You are going to see this. All right, just checking. You can all see the fun little housing box. Okay, just checking. And then if you cannot hear, please give me a thumbs down because I can see you on my other screen.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status,
I think the volume
while
stopped.
28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the US general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system to housing to healthcare to child welfare to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
Like, that was a good place to stop that. And then we show this video every time we do a presentation in recognition that we want everybody to understand that we work from a racial equity lens, knowing that racism is one of the building blocks of oppression that happens in the United States, and it affects how people get access to both housing and supportive services as survivors of violence. And then I think we can go to the next slide.
This next part of our presentation, and thank you so much, Marlena, for showing that video. The next piece of this presentation is going to look at the correlation between sexual and domestic violence and homelessness, housing instability. What is related to sexual and domestic violence and homelessness and housing instability? And I'm going to turn it over to Christy to talk to us a little bit about why an intersectional approach is important.
You, Rebecca. I appreciate that. Okay, sorry, y'all. Trying to advance screens, make sure I'm not on mute, all the wonderful things. So the consortium has taken an intersectional approach, and again, as Marlena said, we're really wanting to put equity at the forefront of the work that we're doing. We recognize that communities of color are disproportionately live in segregated neighborhoods, and often this is in public housing. That they are often further from grocery stores and medical facilities due to the historical racial discrimination redlining in housing policies and land displacement and legacy of colonization. And when we talk about redlining, that kind of has become, a term that most are familiar with. And the way we understand it is really how it's evolved as racial discrimination of any kind in housing. But what it really derives from and where it started was around government maps that were outlined areas where Black residents lived and were therefore deemed risky investments. And so Black families then were not approved for financing to be able to support or to purchase homes. And even though the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, and that was first open legislation that was designed to right the wrongs of the racially biased laws and policies, what we know is even today, there's large areas that are still residential segregation is still existing in the US. So again, it's really important for us to have a focus not only intersectional work between DV, sexual violence, housing, and homelessness, but to really lift up racial inequities and how we can continue to move towards a more equitable approach in expanding housing options for survivors of color. The other thing we've seen is, in the last few years, especially with the pandemic, rental and housing costs are continuing to escalate. And for many, it's just becoming out of reach to even be able to pay rent or even to afford a mortgage. And this is especially true for a lot of communities of color, particularly for African-American communities in the South, who are often the most impacted by housing shifts that are occurring. And the one thing, saying that communities of color and people of color often live further away from necessary resources. This is especially true in rural communities. And just in general, over 25% of victims in small, rural, or remote areas live about 40 miles or further from the closest support program. So when you couple that with support for the survivor of recovering from the trauma, in addition to necessary resources, it just makes being able to find an affordable home in some of these rural areas just even more out of reach for many. So just to kind of give y'all a snapshot of what the statistics look like, what we know is gender violence, or domestic violence, gender and racial inequities are the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. And if you look at a few of the studies that are out there, 80% of homeless women with children have experienced domestic violence. 50% of sexual assaults take place within a mile of the victim's home. 84% of DV shelter residents need help when finding affordable housing. And in a Florida study, over 78% of homeless women in that study had been subjected to some type of sexual violence or physical assault or stalking at some point in their lifetime. And to make matters worse, children, especially the youngest, account for a very high disproportionate share of those threatened with eviction, according to a recent study. And that risk is very acute for Black children and mothers ages 20 to 35. So what we see and understand is survivors face a ton of barriers to being able to maintain or reestablish safe and stable housing. And it's complex, right? We often heard the question in the past, I think it still exists today, why don't survivors just leave? But it's really very complex and multi-level, multi-layered is why. Housing's a huge consideration. Again, if you're thinking about what's going to be next, you're not sure what your finances are. Do you leave with uncertainty hanging over your head if you're going to become homeless? So escaping a DV or a sexual violence situation may mean that the survivor is going to lose their house or their income. They may not have the ability to sustain housing if the abuser leaves and they are able to even stay in their homes. And so it creates an increased risk for evictions. Domestic violence and sexual violence are severe disruptors of survivors' lives. It increases the likelihood that there might be a job loss, facing homelessness, and then couple that with gender pay inequities of just being able to make ends meet in this day and time, put survivors in very precarious situations. Many survivors will stay in an abusive situation in order to maintain housing, especially when there are children in the household. So survivors who can't maintain their own housing are highly vulnerable to re-abuse, and that abuse may be ongoing. Abusers often, as we know, are very persistent in their attempts to continue to sabotage any success that a survivor may have. So just looking at this a little bit more in detail and giving a few examples around economic abuse. So, if you're thinking about how an abuser might prevent resource acquisition, they may be forbidding their partner to work. They may try to sabotage them at their job, wanting them to lose that job. They may be interfering with any type of education or skill building, or they're even tampering with childcare. When you think about preventing resource use, that might be withholding any type of bank account information, denying that survivor access to money, disabling the car, and the examples go on. Exploiting resources could be generating debt in the survivor's name, a deliberate failure to even pay for bills to run a survivor's credit, damaging housing, the unit where they live. So there's going to be a huge financial cost incurred for that damage. And using household money that is intended to go towards paying for rent or for a mortgage, and using that instead for drugs, alcohol, gambling, etc. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca so she can talk a little bit more about specific considerations when working with survivors of sexual violence.
Thank you so much, Christy. So when we're talking about specific considerations for survivors of sexual violence, one of the first things we want to make sure everybody is in agreement on, we're all on the same page on, is what do we mean by sexual violence? Sexual violence oftentimes gets lumped into domestic violence. And so it can get lost in the conversation with no ill intent at all. Sometimes it's difficult to list all the types of victimization, but it's really important that we understand that what we're talking about. It's also important that when we talk about sexual violence, we understand that survivors aren't running around with like sexual violence survivor tattooed on their forehead, or like rape survivor. I mean, there may be some who choose to do that, but most aren't. They are folks who can't pay their mortgage because of some sort of sexual violence that happened a long time ago, and they're showing up at somebody's door, and they're not saying this is because of sexual violence. But when you build trust with them and get to know them, you see that the cause of the housing destabilization is connected to sexual violence. So that's why I want to just take a moment to make sure we're all on the same page. Sexual violence is really any type of unwanted sexual contact. This can include words and acts. So it doesn't require that there be physical contacts. We can think of, verbal sexual harassment, online sexual harassment, groping in public places, forcing people to perform sex acts for money, rape. These are all types of sexual violence that represent kind of any unwanted sexual contact without the survivor's consent. The other thing that is really important for folks on the webinar who may want to support survivors of sexual violence in their housing needs, what's important for you guys to know is that sexual violence is broader than intimate partner violence and can happen throughout the lifespan. So what do I mean by that? Well, this next bullet point kind of clarifies. Basically, sexual violence can happen anytime, anywhere, and anyone can cause sexual violence. So what do I mean by that? When I say it can happen anytime, it can happen when you are being born and the person who is giving birth to you is not able to consent to exams while they're birthing you, or they're put in restraints, or they're given medicines that they don't like, or they are sexually harassed by the people caring for them in the birthing process. So that's like, we're starting with birth, that sexual violence can occur, to old age if people are caring for you and they are violating your sense of sexual safety as an older adult. That is an example of kind of any time on the lifespan sexual harm can occur. When I say sexual harm and sexual violence can happen anywhere, I'm talking about in faith communities, I'm talking about in work, I'm talking about at school, I'm talking about in stadiums, in the streets, online. Sexual violence can happen anywhere. And anyone can cause sexual violence. So it's not just an intimate partner violence. And the reason why I list this difference is because a lot of the resources that are available for survivors of domestic violence in the mainstream federally funded field are for survivors who the sexual violence has happened recently, the sexual violence has happened in their home, and the sexual violence has been caused by an intimate partner. So when we want to talk about the kind of broad needs of survivors of sexual violence, we have to take into account that it can happen anytime, anywhere, and anyone can cause it. And that brings a totally different lens to how we do the work. So how does sexual violence impact housing and economic stability? Well, it can impact housing immediately. So let's say you have a landlord who is saying that I'm going to evict you because your rent is late unless you perform this sex act. That person may immediately decide that they want to leave that housing, or that person may immediately decide they want to work with an advocate to safety plan around that kind of imminent sexual danger. But that person may end up leaving that housing, finding new rental housing, and then 10 years down the line, that person is late on their rent again. And this time they have a landlord who's not going to who's not going to sexually harm them, but they get triggered thinking about what happened the last time they were late on rent with that landlord. And so they get triggered, they have anxiety, they can't go to work, they lose their income, and then they really can't pay their rent. So that's an example of kind of how sexual violence and the trauma can intermittently come back up and destabilize folks. And then again, throughout the lifespan. So just because the sexual violence didn't happen 3 days ago doesn't mean that it can't impact your housing 30 years from now. And those are considerations that are really important when we think about serving the needs of survivors of sexual violence around housing. This other piece I think I've said, but it's worth saying again, is the housing need is not about fleeing or attempting to flee imminent physical violence, right? Some survivors of sexual violence most definitely are trying to flee imminent physical violence, but there's a whole host of survivors who need assistance with homelessness, with housing instability, but they're not fleeing imminent physical violence. And many of the systems that are set up to work with survivors aren't set up to recognize that or respond to it at all. Next slide, please, Christy. So I offered some examples when we were talking, but again, we could be talking about, think of a survivor who experiences sexual assault in prison, in a congregate prison facility, and then they're released to supervision. And they're told you have to stay in a congregate shelter that's just like the place where you experience sexual assault. And you go there and you get triggered and you leave, and then you get put back into prison because you're not complying with the conditions of your release, right? Or we could talk about, folks who have experienced sexual violence at work and lose their jobs and then can't afford to pay for their housing. So those are just a few examples of survivors of sexual violence and how housing impacts them. So the additional kind of considerations for sexual violence survivor has to do with this questions of like, what are the barriers survivors of sexual violence face in getting support for housing stability? As I said, sexual violence is not always the presenting reason, but the underlying cause of instability, and our interventions aren't set up to address these real needs. And I don't think the sexual violence field is alone in this. I think there's a lot of domestic violence survivors who also struggle with this. They're shunted between systems that won't serve them because they don't have a kind of a trauma-informed approach to the reasons that people can have their housing destabilized. Another barrier is limited resources and policies in traditional victim services and housing fields that address these needs across the housing continuum to home ownership. An example of this is like there is limited bridge housing or shelter for non-intimate partner sexual violence survivors. Like they've just not anywhere to go in most places if you are experiencing non-intimate partner sexual violence and you need housing immediately, and you don't have time to look for a lease, like you just need a bridge place to go. In many places there isn't an option for you, and for many survivors, and that's just on the kind of shelter end of the housing continuum. But when you look at like more permanent housing, or you look at transitional housing, or you look at even purchasing a house. In all of those different kind of services and funding models across the housing continuum, there isn't, the systems don't know how to recognize the needs of survivors of sexual violence, and then they don't know how to respond. And so those bring up some of the barriers. Next slide, please. So what are some other intersecting issues that compromise stable housing? Trauma impact on survivors and children is a huge one, and that really addresses that kind of lifespan issue. Racial and gender discrimination in housing. What about like a survivor of sexual assault who is sexually assaulted in their neighborhood and then wants to sell a house that they own? And this survivor is also Hispanic. And is speaking Spanish when the appraising agent arrives at the housing to determine the value of a housing. And then the housing value is decreased by the appraiser because of the race and the language that the person spoke who was trying to sell the house, an example. Also, racial and gender pay equity in the labor market means you get housing, but then you're not making enough money to sustain the housing. And so you may lose the housing. Ongoing legal issues, be it folks who may have evictions or may have criminal legal records that kind of follow them throughout life and really create barriers for them getting into housing. Harassment and sexual harassment, coercion from landlords, we talked about that. I think this is happening a lot and is really not really addressed in a lot of places because landlords have so much power and it's so hard to find housing in the first place. Fears about child custody and deportation are intersecting issues that compromise stable housing. Isolation from social supports, stalking-prone abusers, interrupted sabotaged employment history, criminal records, bad credit, and a partner that controls money and household resources. Fear or abandoning household pets is a big one. And then this kind of broader context of shortage of affordable housing programs, and shelters lead to a lot of barriers and a lot of reasons why survivors of sexual and domestic violence struggle to find the housing and the services they need to stay stably housed into the future. And then there's this piece around understanding the homeless and housing service system. While experiences of sexual and domestic violence are pervasive among those who experience homelessness, the systems have not historically been designed to meet the needs of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. They're really designed to offer immediate shelter. In the case of domestic violence survivors, they're not even designed to do that for sexual violence survivors, and swift connections to permanent housing. But we just talked about the fact that there isn't a lot of permanent housing or affordable permanent housing for a lot of survivors. There's also this issue of survivors being caught between two systems. So if you come in and say, I am homeless to a lot of victim service providers, organizations, they will say, oh, we can't work with you because you're homeless, go over to the homeless system. And then the survivor goes over to the homeless system and the homelessness system says, oh, I'm sorry, we can't help you because you're a victim, you need to go back to this system. And so people are kind of caught without a place to go because no one really sees the complex kind of intersections of their needs. So in other words, homeless and housing systems have often lacked the victim-centered, trauma-informed advocacy approach that we know is critical. There have been significant policy and practice shifts with federal funding, like the Domestic Violence HUD Bonus Fund, to increase access for survivors, but more is needed for sexual assault survivors, most definitely. And again, we appreciate the opportunity to be here to lift up some of those needs today. Thank you.
Thank you for all that information, Rebecca. Hopefully you all can hear me. And we are now going to move in talking about best practices for safe housing access. Some of the things we're going to cover are a couple of pilot projects that have happened at various places across the country, and then also what we all could be mindful of in moving towards housing. And so one of the first projects that we would like to acknowledge is one of the more famous ones is the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They were provided funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to conduct two projects, one starting in 2010 and another one starting in 2015, over domestic violence housing first. And domestic violence housing first is basically the understanding that survivors are probably going to get the most support if they are provided housing first, so that they feel safe in order to actually access and think about services beyond that. And the project itself, obviously, the first one, as noted, was 5 years long, and then the next one was 4 years long, and then there were toolkits, and they are both, all of them are actually available on the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence's webpage. One of the main tenets of this project was basically identifying the key components that support people in domestic violence housing first. The first one is survivor-driven, trauma-informed, and mobile advocacy. Please don't mind me looking over to the side. I just want to make sure that I'm actually saying these tenets correctly, which basically recognizes that in order to support survivors, you be mindful of meeting them where they are. Most of the time, people expect that survivors are just going to come into program spaces and they're readily available to do that. But how are we as advocates mindful of the experiences that survivors are having? Where do they need to be in community? Where do they feel safest to be able to engage? And also being mindful of their need for privacy and confidentiality. We know most of the programs are provide supports to survivors, and not all of them have closed room spaces, if you will, that allow survivors to be as vulnerable as they feel they can be in talking about their experiences and their needs. So we're always listening to what it is that they are asking for. Is there a space that they feel more comfortable in? Does that actually mean that you as an advocate are going out into various places and communities, which could be housing that they are currently in versus a more public social place like a library, if you will? And what does that support mean, and being willing to provide that sort of support? And then another aspect is flexible financial assistance. We've heard that flexible financial assistance has been like a big part of support for survivors, and flexible financial assistance is providing, depending on what organization you're looking at, is small bits, not small bits, but like specified amounts of cash, direct cash assistance to survivors. And the more appropriate aspect of this is not trying to ask survivors what it is that they're doing, so that you can nickel and dime them, versus them coming to you and saying, hey, I need $100, $500, whatever it is that your program can max them out at. And you just accepting that and saying, hey, you're going to use it for your best needs, rather than us assuming that you may not have best intentions. There are programs that we've heard of, most of us have seen, that identify the lack of desire for this sort of flexible financial assistance because they're afraid that survivors are going to mismanage money and not use them directly for housing needs. But the question is always, how are we looking at the full picture? So if a survivor is identifying that they need money to get their car fixed, are we not thinking of that as a supportive housing need, saying that, hey, they need to get to work? And if they can't get to work, there's a likelihood that they're going to get fired. And if they get fired, they still can't afford their housing, versus the reality that they may need to go pick up their kids, and they find it might be a way for them to not engage closely with the person that has abused them, and being mindful of that as being supportive as well. So it's like a full thought processy that doesn't directly relate to how we see housing as the physical location that somebody is in. And then you also have community engagement as the last component of the DV Housing First model, which basically identifies that you within your program, how are you engaging with the community? Knowing that community services and actually having that connection, survivors are more likely to feel supported. They are more likely to feel like there is a pathway towards healing, if that is something that people are invested in thinking about related to survivors, and how they can support themselves feeling safe. And I feel like that is something that knowing that those three things are the components, it's thinking about the survivor first and what they need and trusting that they know how to articulate and how to process everything. And then I'm going to ask for the next slide, please. Okay, so the next project that we're going to highlight is the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, worked with the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania. There was a flexible funding project that was started in 2021. And it's continued through 2020, like into 2023. And I'm pretty sure from my understanding with the individual who is leading the project is going to continue this year as well. The LGBTQ Center of Central Pennsylvania, they have a program called GLOW, which is for LGBTQ plus individuals of color. And the reason that we wanted to work with this program is the recognition of those who are part of the LGBTQ plus community who are people of color are far more likely to be impacted by aspects of violence and experiencing homelessness compared to um, non-BIPOC members of the community. So, like mentioned, the principles of flexible funding within this regard is like the survivor-driven advocacy and recognizing that the survivor knows their situation best. And then low barrier access, once again, thinking about not trying to make people fill out forms to identify exactly what it is that they're going, like what they need the money for. Just say the individual comes to you and says, hey, I need XYZ amount of money, and I'm going, and you just giving it to them without forcing them to explain things. And then supporting a variety of different needs with no limitations on the amount or frequency of funding was also part of this. So programs at times will say if we give people money, we're going to give people it based off of what we think is an emergency. And that winds up keeping funds away from people. So say you somebody says that they need $100 because they need to get a wardrobe, if you will, for like a job or to find a job or an interview that they actually have. And you as a program say, well, we think that is important, but also we feel like we might want to wait to see how much funding to see about this funding, given that we're expecting, or there might be the potentiality of somebody coming in and saying they need $1,000 to either break their lease or they need to find a way to fix up their housing after abuse has happened and the abuser has caused damage to a unit. And trying to nickel and dime or trying to prioritize things in that manner is not helpful because it means that a survivor who is in front of you at that moment is not being provided the support that they need in recognition that you're looking for somebody who may not even exist. And even thinking about the nature of funding, some of these funding streams have to be used up within specific timeframes. And if you are choosing not to engage and provide these fundings as much as you can, what does that actually mean when you have to send money back? And the reality that that might show it within the grant process of, oh, well, the this flexible funding situation that you've might written into your grant is not really useful at all. And then I would also like to mention that with flexible funding, there is a need to identify how you can provide monetary support to survivors who are coming in. It's there are people who might say, if there's a way you can give it to me in cash, that's necessary. What does a check look like in relation to this person having access to a bank? Cashier's checks. Do they have a direct deposit account that you are willing to actually support them in, or a gift card, if you will? And be mindful that you should be asking survivors what it is that they would like this disbursement to look like and being able to provide as an organization different types of disbursement methods. And then within this slide, I also notified that there is a report and an infographic related to this flexible funding program. If I'm remembering correctly, this PowerPoint is going to be sent out afterwards and everything is linked. All right, can you put to the next slide, please? And then the last one I'm going to mention is probably one of the older ones, which is from the District Alliance for Safe Housing. And they had a domestic violence housing task force that they worked with in DC, wherein they wanted to address and alleviate systemic barriers facing survivors. And they provided a needs assessment, they developed a document, and then I am going to acknowledge that once again, the Safe Housing Partnerships website, which we all collaborate on making sure resources can go to, has a project report there. And then I am going to pass it off, I think, again to Rebecca.
Thank you, Marlena. So I'm going to talk a little bit about really high level, some approaches for lifespan, non-intimate partner, sexual violence kind of housing work. And I have to first say, and I apologize, I didn't say it earlier, I am here because of the Sexual Assault in Housing Collaborative. The Sexual Assault in Housing Collaborative is a group of folks who came together to start working on the unique needs of survivors of sexual violence kind of throughout the lifespan and more broadly than intimate partner violence. And that group of folks is the National Organization of Sisters of Color Ending Sexual Assault, the Resource Sharing Project, which is a partnership between the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. So I'm here today actually presenting on behalf of the National Sexual Violence Resource Center because they're a part of the consortium in the Safe Housing Partnerships work. And so they asked me to be here because there was just a scheduling conflict, honestly. So wanted to say, first of all, that is some work that's going on at the national level to address the unique housing needs of survivors of sexual assault. So I always have to thank Carla and Louie at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center because they would probably be here today if there hadn't been a scheduling issue. And then just really high level, I have to say, culturally specific programs historically have done housing work for survivors of sexual violence with little specific funding or recognition from the mainstream field. That's the reality. I worked at a culturally specific program when I was an advocate, and we did all kinds of housing work without receiving a lot of specific housing funding. And we actually did a lot of advocacy and training with the big shelter programs where I worked in a time where you couldn't get services if you didn't come into the domestic violence shelter. So I have to say that that's been happening. And so what does that mean for you listening to this webinar today? Like if you're in a community and there's culturally specific organizations in your community, reach out, find out what they've been doing. Maybe they have grants that you could partner on. Maybe they could teach you something about how to do this work. If you want to partner with culturally specific organizations on your grant, make sure that it's not just a token thing. Make sure that they are part of building the grant and the deliverables, that they're getting paid so that they can be a part of the work and not just brought in as kind of a points thing to help a program get more money. So I got to say that. And then, across the nation, because there hasn't until more recently been a lot of federal funding that specifically addressed the housing needs of survivors of non-intimate partner sexual violence, rape crisis centers and dual domestic and sexual violence programs have been using federal and state sexual assault grants to provide housing advocacy. So helping people to get into other people's housing programs, using some of the flexible financial assistance they may have in some housing funding, federal housing funding, or just federal victim services grants to pay a deposit, pay first and last month's rent, pay for a car that's broken down so somebody can get to work so they don't lose their job and lose their housing. So I have to call out that reality that a lot of people use pretty small pot of federal money and some smaller pots of state money, depending on where you are, to provide housing advocacy and some direct financial assistance. I also have to say what I know about, because this is the majority of my work at the Resource Sharing Project, is OVW-funded transitional housing grantees are working to increase access and enhance services for survivors of non-intimate partner lifespan sexual violence. That's actually the majority of my work, is working with OVW transitional housing grantees, and that is 6 to 24 months of housing that's voluntary. You don't have to show your income to get into that housing. It's super low barrier, super flexible. And there's work being done by some rape crisis center grantees and some dual and standalone sexual assault coalitions to provide the meanings of the letters. I saw a thing come in. IPV, that letter, and apologies for everybody, IPV means intimate partner violence. I'm not sure if that's the particular letter. Someone just chatted a question into the chat. If there's another letter or alphabet soup that I have used that you want me to define, please let me know, and apologies to the participants. And then some other stuff I wanted to mention is OVW, Office on Violence Against Women. Yes, OVW is Office on Violence Against Women, which is in the Department of Justice, and they receive the bulk of money that is authorized under the Violence Against Women Act. And one of those grant programs is transitional housing, OVW, or Office on Violence Against Women. Transitional housing. Oh, yes. And so someone also is asking about FIPSA ARP. So, and I was going to define this speaking. So there's the use of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act American Rescue Plan money, and someone can correct me if I said that wrong, to provide bridge housing and hotel motel stays to sexual assault survivors. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Act money had historically just focused on the needs of intimate partner violence survivors. And then during the pandemic, there was some advocacy to get some additional money that would focus FIPSA funding on the needs of sexual assault survivors and also the needs of culturally specific communities of color organizations. So that's what FIPSA ARP is. And the FIPSA ARP money flows through Health and Human Services at the federal level, and then oftentimes comes to, depending on the type of funding, to a state or territory pass-through organization, or there are some grants that have been sent directly to organizations to work on sexual assault and culturally specific communities of color work. The other piece I didn't put on the slide, but I did want to mention because it's out there, is Victims of Crime Act funding. That's VOCA. It also comes through the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime, OVC. They have some Victim of Crime Act money, VOCA money, that while I know there are some concerns about that funding being cut, they have historically been have grants for providing housing, transitional housing, and more recently the housing has been more flexible, housing for survivors of sex trafficking. So for folks who are on the call, if you can go to their website and look up who are the recipients of those grantees, if they issue a solicitation in the future for people to apply, make sure that you're on those that you go to OVC's website and sign up for information about when they are going to be announcing additional funding rounds for that housing. So those are a few kind of housing funding sources and approaches to, and that's just a few. There's more work going on. We just don't have the time to get into it today. Those are a few of the kind of funding sources or programs that have supported the unique needs of survivors of sexual assault in the housing arena. And I'll turn it back over. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you. And then we're talking about a necessary shift in safe housing. Most of the time when people talk about supports in relation to those experiencing homelessness, they automatically go to shelters. And usually it's communal shelters. And as we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic, most people don't feel safe in communal shelters. Even before COVID-19, people were not feeling safe in communal shelters due to the lack of privacy, due to the fear of people not getting along, and what does a fight look like? Other programs actually trying to require people to clean communal spaces, and people not feeling it's necessary for them, especially as they are working towards feelings of safety and actually experiencing trauma due to violence. So we are trying to promote the reality that permanent housing is a better option. I say this as a individual who also knows that there needs to be a variety of housing options or supportive shelter options. Knowing that if we're talking about people who are in tribal communities, they recognize that because housing in its totality is lacking, especially safe housing that is not crowded, does not experiencing overcrowding, they are hoping to get shelter access, build shelters within their communities to make sure that people are housed and stay in communities, versus other individuals who are on the other spectrum that are looking for permanent housing that could be a permanent rental or actually owning their own home. Trying to access those, knowing that we have a weird housing shortage in this country due to rising housing costs, and then also people needing being able to afford anything based off of the lower wages that we're all recognizing are real. So, like as mentioned in the slide, we've traditionally focused on emergency and transitional housing, but they're only temporary solutions. And knowing that there is a sincere lack of permanent housing, especially rentals in this country, what happens if you have a mandatory 18-month stay in transitional housing, or there is a desire to have like 90 days maximum within your shelter space? And how do you move forward from there? There has been a notice that a number of shelters have been experiencing a lack of space, which means that people are being turned away. And this either leads to people going back to an abusive house, a house where they are experiencing abuse, or going back to they may wind up living on the streets, and that's something that we would all prefer not to happen, knowing how there is an increased likelihood for further violence if they are unhoused and unsheltered in that manner. So we are recognizing that HUD has increased a lot of funding over the last couple of years for these sort of housing accesses that move beyond congregate shelter, to make sure that these accesses are in place for people. Like was mentioned in Rebecca's portion of the presentation, these funding accesses have included things like um, ARP collaborations, if you will, knowing that people might be willing to go into hotels. How do we build up transitional housing work and collaborate across systems to make sure that that is also happening as well? I'm hoping I'm not missing anything else. Does anybody think I've missed anything else in this slide? Okay, then I am done, and I'm going to slide it back over. I think it is to Christy.
Great, thanks, Marlena. So, given you all of this information, we wanted to highlight a few things that communities are doing, in addition to the great work programs have been doing that Marlena reviewed around best practices and increasing safe housing shelter, doing a little bit more of a focus on the communities themselves. So in the last several years, there's been a lot of innovative things coming out of community. One is really more and more cross-sector work between the different fields, between gender-based violence and the homeless and housing field, and these task forces cooperating, collaborating better instead of operating in silo. We've talked a lot about flexible funding, and I think, not enough good things can be said about it, as more and more federal funders are coming on board due to the work that a lot of grassroots programs have done to show that flexible funding works, it's effective, and it's survivor-centered. So in and of that, federal funders are being more flexible in allowing how grant dollars are expended. We talked a little bit about it before. I just want to give a quick example of the District Alliance for Safe Housing, or DASH. One of the things that they were seeing was a survivor had come to them for financial assistance and was needing about $8,000. And what that ended up being was 3 months of back rent that her abuser walked out, left her holding the bag for. And while she had a job and was able to maintain housing going forward, it just was going to be completely unrealistic to get that $8,000. So, sometimes grants in the past have been very prescriptive in a dollar amount allowed to be able to help. but through flexible funding, that was a one-time need that was able to provide that woman not only that survivor assistance, financial assistance, but ensure housing stability going forward. So looking at different housing models and ensuring there is a survivor lens on those models, particularly with the permanent supportive housing model. And for those who may not know, permanent supportive housing is a part of the HUD housing, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. One of their housing models, typically it has been designed to be able to, as the name states, provide long-term housing with wraparound or supportive services. And it has been in the past intended for people who are experienced chronic homelessness or long-term homelessness, and who also have some type of a disability, whether it's a medical disability, mental health disability, substance use disability. We know that just putting survivors into that model without taking in the very specific trauma-related issues that they have, that they're not going to be successful always for just that standard model. So really, with research and with practice, being able to demonstrate how tweaking those models and putting a survivor lens on it is beneficial for creating and maintaining housing stability for survivors. In the last several years, really centering voices with lived experience. We've talked about being survivor-centered for a long time, but if we're centering those voices, it really is being more survivor-driven and being very intentional about how we are including survivors, especially survivors who come from marginalized communities or culturally specific communities, right? To make sure they're at the table in leadership, in advocacy, and in informing how policies and practices are implemented. Building the capacity of culturally specific victim service providers and rape crisis centers, and also state coalitions. We talked early on that culturally specific programs have traditionally not had the same kind of access to mainstream grant programs that other victim service providers have. And if a culturally specific program is getting a grant that is designed specifically for serving culturally specific survivors, it is often not the same amount grant dollar award as what if you were applying through a traditional, and I'm going to put that in quotes, grant program. So it really is, how do we start building capacity for these programs? Because we want to ensure that not only are they able to serve survivors, but that we are removing the barriers and creating equitable situations that survivors of color and survivors from culturally specific communities have the same type of access to safe housing. Developing new housing opportunities is always great. I think, again, we're being a little innovative in how things are happening. Just with post-pandemic, we've seen where being able to use federal dollars to convert hotels to apartments is in process, and we're seeing more and more of this. And so it's, I think, an exciting model to look at, especially for creating more housing options for survivors of violence. More victim service providers are looking at how to get into housing development and using low-income housing tax credits to do actual sticks and bricks development for housing dedicated solely for survivors. And we're also increasing the types of housing vouchers for survivors. And when we're thinking about housing vouchers, it's typically, project-based housing vouchers that come through local public housing authorities. And so there's a wide array of vouchers now that are available. There's preferences that can be set up for survivors of violence. Emergency housing vouchers are in use now, as well as stability housing vouchers. So we want to be mindful of how are we ensuring we're setting preference in increasing access for survivors to get the housing vouchers, and that means assistance for long-term affordable housing. So when we're thinking about what needs to happen for us to move forward, we've talked a lot about centering racial equity in this over the last few years. Really, that discourse is gone from just having a national dialogue to really looking strategically at policies and practices that have been in place that created disparity between for culturally specific communities and communities of color. And so again, it's not just checking off a box and saying, oh, we're striving to be more equitable, but really, what are the strategies, the policy changes, the practice changes that go into play to make sure we are? And how are we ensuring that survivors and people with lived experience are informing how that work happens? We also want to be sure that we are including sexual assault providers in that conversation as well, along with the culturally specific providers, to ensure there's a broad array of voices there. And as Rebecca talked about, there's a lot of things that have been in practice for a while, but it hasn't always been inclusive of sexual assault providers, and certainly not culturally specific providers. So we're seeing a huge shift there. And again, centering survivor voice. It's not enough just to be survivor centered. We really need to be intentional about being survivor driven in practice, policy, and advocacy. How do we expand access and choice, again, to ensure more equity in the housing choice options and availability of affordable housing for survivors across the board? Recognizing that housing is a right and that it is a public health issue. There is a definite connection between housing and healthcare. And we also need to recognize and underscore the importance that housing is a right, and everyone has a right to a safe and affordable house or home. There's economic justice models and things in practice that need to go into play that we need to consider. And there is a tremendous amount from the pandemic that we're still analyzing, learning from, and lifting up. And so that's still an ever-growing area where we're learning and trying to figure out what are the strategies to help us move forward. And what we know is peer learning and creating those peer-to-peer opportunities sparks change. It's helped us to rethink how shelter happens. And so, again, typically we've thought about shelter in the way of congregate housing. We're having more and more programs looking at, should hotel be a way of providing shelter in a safe environment for survivors, particularly in smaller and rural communities? What we've learned is also that the need for investing in a full range of survivor-specific housing. It's not simply enough to look at the different housing models in the housing and homelessness sector and just say, okay, how does this work? A lot of things need to go into play to make sure that that is DV housing first models are happening in that sector as well. Not forgetting about the DV housing first approach. A lot of research has gone into that, as well as the work that WSCA, Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and other coalitions and programs have done to really lift that up as an evidence-based practice. The expanding use of flex funding. We're going to be talking about flexible funding coming on down the way for several years, especially as government agencies are getting much more flexible around the types of or the ways that flexible funding can be used. And also, as Marlena talked about, actually being able to put cash in hand to survivors without putting them through the paces of how are you spending this, or, the stereotypes and preconceived notions that they're misspending that money and they're going out and spending it on drugs and alcohol, right? So really trusting survivors knows what's best and giving them, putting money in hand so they can best address what their needs are. And then promoting conversation-based assessment around trauma-informed coordinated entry. And this is really looking at not only for survivors, but also how do we lift that up when we are partnering across the homelessness and housing field, that when we are trying to do coordinated entry and find suitable housing options for anyone who's at risk or experiencing homelessness, we do that through a trauma-informed lens. It's so important for survivors, but if you think about it, everybody has probably had a level or degree of trauma that they've been through, and then we need to be lifting that up as a best practice, bar none. And broadening the way services are provided, that we really want to make sure that services are voluntary, that we're not saying that programs have to do, or survivors and participants have to do X, Y, and Z to be able to get access to services or housing, We really want to be able to increase our mobile advocacy and be able to meet survivors where they are. And also, because of the way things have happened since the pandemic, figuring out how can we do advocacy virtually and still engage and successfully with survivors. So a few things that peer learning has been able to move us forward and continues to do and helping us to be forward thinking and innovative. So that was fast and furious, but I'm happy to say you have been probably wondering, well, when is Dee going to talk to us? And it's now. So Dee Fox, I am passing off to you now.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks to all of my co-presenters for taking the heavy lift on presenting today. I am going to wrap us up and do it quickly so we can have time to have conversation and make sure we answer all of your questions. But I'm going to do a bird's eye view, higher level discussion and presentation on how the stats look and what the national landscape housing realities are for survivors. So this information is, very helpful in your communities as you're thinking of planning and requesting funding. You're thinking like, how am I going to do all this programming? How am I going to make sure there's more access to resources for survivors? Making the case and having stats and information to do that really is helpful. So just to put it into context, and I know it was mentioned earlier, some of the systemic issues around survivors accessing housing. There's a real lack of housing, lack of affordable housing in particular in our country, and there's a couple of national studies or national snapshots that confirm that reality. So we do a census count. So if you're a domestic violence program and part of a state domestic violence coalition, you work with the organization that I'm a part of, NADV, to submit your data to us. And that's been very helpful to have a national snapshot of what it looks like across the country. So in any given time on this one day in September, we do this every year annually, and this was the 17th annual back in September of 2022. On that day, there was about 45,000 survivors and their kiddos who were receiving shelter and housing, and there was about a 12,500 requests for unmet needs for services, particularly over 50% of those unmet needs were for housing and emergency shelters. So if you go to our website, there's additional information that breaks it down by state. So you can have state level information as well as you're making the case for the gaps in housing for survivors. And then we also work very closely as national partners with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. They also do the Out of Reach snapshot that's annual. And unfortunately, I know I go by Fox, also Debbie, like Debbie Downer portion is that there's nowhere in our country where anyone can be working full time and afford a modest 2-bedroom rental home. So we're in a real dire situation in our country with a lack of affordable housing, and even working full time doesn't cut it. And for those who follow the point in time count, that was back in January. That's HUD point in time count of people experiencing homelessness in our country. The last point in time count that was done in January of 2023, we saw a 12% increase in homelessness. So that's not just an individual issue, that is a systemic issue that we're seeing all across the country as housing prices increase. So next slide, please. We've discussed a little bit about this. There's a lot of demand for housing. And, when I got in this field 30 years ago, it used to be someone would come into shelter, a DV shelter in particular, would come, and then we'd be able to get them housing within the community, and usually affordable housing. That is not happening anymore. And we have a shortage, about 7.3 million rental home shortage in our country. And we're also seeing both cities, suburban, urban, and rural shortages, as well as the landscape has changed since the pandemic. And then we know that inflation is decreasing, and there's talk about things kind of leveling out, but over the last few years and with the pandemic, there's just the cost of living, everything is more expensive than it used to be, in particular rent and housing costs. There's really high interest rates for home loans, so getting in the door and then buying or purchasing a home is very cost prohibitive for working families and working folks, and probably many people on this call. And we talked about wage disparities earlier, and that continues to be a barrier as people are historically and systemically locked out from access to building wealth through home ownership. And we've been through this collective experience, but there's been a lot of transformation within the world and within our country as a result of the pandemic, and a lot of changes there. So next slide, please. Um, one of the things that we have been able um, to change and to make a significant systemic change around is having rights. Survivors do have rights within their housing and within housing programs that are funded by the federal government. This is a whole other training in and of itself. So this is just like a touch point, so you all are familiar with the Violence Against Women Act. It was passed in 2022, which is hard to believe. It's been a couple of years now. And that basically says if you are a survivor of domestic or sexual violence, you cannot lose your housing if you're in federally assisted housing. So when you're applying for programs or accessing programs with that are government covered, you should have a notice of those rights. And if you are not able to get access to housing as a result of something related to your abuse, or if you're asked to leave your housing as a result of abuse or something that's happened with the harm doer, you're able to have those housing rights and work to try to stay within that housing program. So there's a whole training we could do on that. We don't have a lot of time, but I just want to make sure people are familiar with that. There's also a new website, the Fair Housing website has information. I think it's FHEO/VAWA, where if your VAWA housing rights are violated, you can go to that website and fill out that information, and HUD will assist in an investigation around that housing rights violation. All right, next slide, please. Oh, we're already to Q&A. One more thing, I am going to do a quick plug before we open up for Q&A. There was also some really important research that came out this past week, and it's getting a lot of airtime in papers and on the news, but there was also a really helpful study that came out of the UCSF around domestic violence and the intersection of housing and homelessness that basically says we need to address violence and prevent violence if we're going to address homelessness, as it's one of the main issues of homelessness. And so there's really great information, very awful information. I think it's a call to action, but just what survivors are experiencing, both in their homes and why they need to attempt to flee, but also as they're seeking safety or coming to services, that they're still experiencing a lot of trauma and harassment and re-victimization as a result of seeking help, and that their harm doers are still often trying to sabotage their lives. So that's really also there's really great policy recommendations and things we can be thinking about in the field of how we want to move things forward and address the intersection of domestic violence and sexual violence and housing in our country. So I will open it up for questions. And thank you, Rebecca, for putting the VAWA complaint form process in there and more information. And so there's been a lot of positive changes, but there's still so much work to be done, and glad that you all are out there doing such great work. So we'll open it up right now.
Thank you so much. That was really incredible. I learned so much today. So happy to have you all presenting. We'll give our participants a few minutes to type in your chat into the chat or into the Q&A. If you all have questions later, I'm sure that our participants wouldn't mind asking questions directly if you want to share your information in the chat box. So we'll just give everybody a few minutes. Just a reminder, this was recorded and we will be sending out a recording later this week. If there's any other questions and follow-up, we're here for a few more minutes.
Christy, if you're trying to
Oh,
say something, you're muted.
it looks like somebody just said thank you for the information.
Oh, Marlena, thank you for telling me that. Do you want to go ahead and take this slide since I just went off script and while I was muted?
Did you want me
No,
to talk about the
I
slide?
will if you want. If it's up to you.
We're all good.
So
Well,
what I said, y'all, I'm sorry, is while we're waiting on questions, y'all please put some good questions in there. We are happy. We are always love good questions. Safe Housing Partnerships is a wonderful site for all things resources, and you can see everything that's listed here for the array of resources that we have. There's also a way to submit questions via the website, or certainly post webinar today, we can include our contact information if you want to reach out directly.
okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I was just oh, sorry,
no,
Sierra.
go ahead.
I just was going to echo what Christy said. We're available for a resource if you're thinking about applying for the various funding streams that are out there, or your current grantees. But there is funding and resources specifically for survivors from HUD, from OVW. A lot of folks. I know that there's talk of cuts maybe with VOCA, but a lot of programs have done really innovative work, and there are resources out there if you're interested in expanding or starting a housing program.
We did get a question. What is the name of the recent report released over the weekend?
So that report was specifically from the UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. I put the link in the chat, and they just had a webinar regarding that. So you can click on the link, but it's through the USCF. I don't know if I'm saying this right. Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative. And it's really a great study because there's an advisory board of survivors with lived expertise who were part of it. And it was a very comprehensive study. So I particularly think the policy recommendations have some great talking points in there that people can use as well.
Great. Well, thank you all again. If you have any questions, wait, it looks like we do have one. Oops, sorry, I just got a million emails.
And Rebecca, there's one on, oh, sorry, go ahead, Sierra.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say it looks like there is. Our agency receives funding through OVC, but not an OVW grant. Are there any recommendation tips you can provide in terms of applying for these specific grants in the area of housing?
Yes, I see from Jorge. Yes. So you can definitely, I put in the chat, and I don't know if Sierra was able to copy and paste the OVW Office on Violence Against Women Transitional Housing Grant. I think you may
Yes.
not have, I don't know if that
Oh,
got
I see
copied
this
and
one.
pasted
Okay,
back
let me
out.
put that.
It's one more, sorry. So
That's
you
okay.
can go to OVW's website and look at their kind of description. The other thing that is really helpful if you're interested in doing transitional housing for survivors of sexual assault is looking at past solicitations for the funding. And I'm going to pop the last grant in the last grant in the chat as well, so you can look at that. Jorge, you can also email me. We do work with folks who are potential grantees on what it would look like to serve survivors of sexual violence using OVW transitional housing money. And the grants are upwards of $500,000 for 3 years, again, to provide 6 to 24 months of housing to survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And you can pay 100% of someone's rent. You don't have to do step down rental scales, which is, for a lot of survivors can be a barrier. So be happy to talk more about that with you. And I am looking for the transitional housing solicitation as we speak, so I can pop the last one in the chat, because typically the future solicitations are very similar to the past solicitations. And we are actually expecting, let's see, here is the FY23 fiscal year 23 so OVWT housing solicitation. And if anyone was saying anything to me, I was like not even seeing the screen. So look at the past solicitation. Again, shoot me an email if you'd like to chat more. And we're expecting the fiscal year 24 solicitation to drop any day now. You should be able to see it. And if you sign up, let me also go to OVW's website. You can get information, you can get alerts for when new solicitations have come out. And I
Oh, I see it. I'll put it in the chat.
can you put it? Okay. I can't find it right now. They've redone their website a while ago, and I'm still learning the new website. News, let's see. News, press releases. There's a way to get information from the Office on Violence Against Women about upcoming solicitations or when they've just released solicitations. And I'm looking for that link to pop in the chat. If anybody else has other questions, I'll shut up now. And I'll keep looking for that link and I'll pop in the chat. Thanks for the great question.
Great. All right. Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. If you have any other questions, now is your opportunity. If not, I want to thank you again for coming to our January webinar, and thank you again to our panelists. Incredible, incredible workshop today. So thank you all again. Have a great day, everyone.
You all.